Hello, everyone. The title of today's lecture is Black and Educated, Unveiling the Contradictions and Redesigning the Future. For me, what it has meant to be Black and educated has meant being uprooted from my cultural heritage and being forced to take on a Eurocentric perspective. And that has prevented me from transforming the world, transforming my continent, transforming Canada at the time and at the pace that I thought was necessary. At today's lecture, I'm going to be speaking about 5 key things. First of all, I'll be making a case that the reason why these educational experiences for Black people continues to persist is because there's been a misconceptualization of colonialism, and the legacies of colonialism hasn't been tackled yet. Secondly, I'll be making a case, or I would be arguing, that the project of decolonization must continue. We don't live in a post-colonial world. The world is still very colonial. So we need to strap our boots and keep working at it. Thirdly, I would be outlining an alternative vision for what I think the world needs to look like. And fourthly, I'll be laying out the implications for education. And lastly, I'll be laying out the implications for Black students, the university, and allies. But before I do that, I will tell you a story about myself, how I came to Canada, and what got me here. Okay. So in 2003, I moved from Nigeria to Canada with the hopes of becoming a leader, and I arrived at Grand Prairie Regional College. And at Grand Prairie, I was met with a lot of interesting questions. People wanted to know why I spoke such good English, why my Nigerian outfit was a costume, if I was painted Black. So I was a bit taken aback by those questions, and I wondered why and where are these questions coming from? The other Nigerian students that were at Grand Prairie Regional College had the same experience. So I thought, well, the Igbo girl in me that is very enterprising, I'm like, well, I'm going to make a business out of this problem. So I decided that I was going to plan a show. So I decided to talk to the only Black professor that was at Grand Prairie Regional College about the idea of planning a show. I also reached out to the other Nigerian students there. Everyone was on board. So on March 27th, 2005, we planned one-of-a-kind African show in Grand Prairie. And our goal was simply to open the minds of Grand Prairians, to tell them, of course, I'm not painted Black, I'm different, and you need to know that I'm different. The next day after the show, we were on the front cover of the local newspaper, and we raised $500, which we donated to the HIV organization in Grand Prairie. At the end of that year, I was due to continue my studies, and I had to leave Grand Prairie, so I moved to University of Alberta. At University of Alberta, I had similar questions, but there was even something more spectacular, in that everywhere I went to, everybody seemed to be trying to save Africa. There was a big sale everywhere you go to, somebody selling bracelets. In the class, you know, people talked about how the West has failed Africa and how the West needs to go, you know, fix Africa. So I wondered, what is wrong with Africa? When I lived in Nigeria, I never thought there was a problem. Upon doing further research, I found that, in fact, we had a problem. And all along, the truth about my history, about my heritage, about the place I feel and occupy in this world has been denied of me. So I was really, really angry that it took me coming all the way to Canada to learn about my history. And I was enraged that the Nigerian education system that was supposed to be developing the next generation of leaders was allowing young people graduate without them knowing who they really were, without understanding the importance of their immediate cultural environment, and understanding how their immediate cultural environment is something that must be tackled. I was also upset with the University of Alberta because all of these concerns had no place in the classes I took. So this led me to starting Unveiling Africa. So we Unveiling Africa in Edmonton. All I wanted to do was provide a platform for young Africans in diaspora to take ownership for transforming the continent, in spite of the fact that they're not at home. After 4 years, we had planned more than 10 speaker series, we organized conferences, we had alliances with other students, and I just did not feel that it was enough. I felt like we weren't really dealing with the real problem, which was, in my opinion, the fact that many of us were leaving the secondary school system without knowing who we were, without understanding what the issues are, and without us being able to tailor our university aspirations to respond to these problems that we should have seen at the secondary school level. So in 2010, I decided that I was going to pack up my bags and move back to Nigeria. In Nigeria, I started Unveiling Africa. While I was there, we organized a number of essay contests. We started publishing a magazine for teenagers. We organized many conferences. Students began to plan community events within their different schools. Now, by that time, I had worked with probably more than 2,000 young people. The students we had worked with were gaining admission into top universities across the world. But it was clear to me that the problem in Nigeria and the fact that young people were going through school not thinking critically, not being passionate, wasn't something one-off events could do. It was clear that the system was entirely broken and we needed to overhaul the system. So this informed my decision to come to OISE to be able to look for an education solution for Nigeria. So getting to OISE, my first year at OISE was intellectually lonely in that I was always the only black girl in my classes. So discussions about how to change things on the continent, about how to, reposition the education system was something I couldn't have with anybody because nobody understood what I was talking about. In terms of mentorship, there were no professors in my department that understood what I was talking about. It was at the tail end of my second year that I got connected to Judge Day, Njoki Wayne, and John Patelli. Now, I did not plan to do a PhD initially, but because I only started to learn about what I came to learn at the tail end of my master's, it became important to do a PhD. What I also, as I've moved up, as I've become more successful academically, socially, I've been invited to a lot of spaces, like the World Economic Forum. I've got into places like Massey, and I found that when I get to these places, not only that I'm the only black person there, especially and at World Economic Forum, the only black person with an anti-colonial view, I found that racism always welcomed me there. At Massey College, I had an incident where a student told me that some cultures are better than others because one culture does female genital mutilation. There's another residence that I was in, and the student there told me that there's another side to colonialism. And I was like, what? Another side to colonialism? What is the other side to killing and stealing other people's land? I don't get it. And in these instances, I never felt that I had the knowledge to give an appropriate response because I too had been educated to think that colonization was the salvation of black people. I'd been educated to think that without colonization, I wouldn't be here. How would I would be an illiterate, quote unquote. Throughout the course of my research, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what does it mean for black people to be educated and what should it mean for us to be educated in light of all the problems, in light of all the humiliation our community has gone through, in light of the fact that the world is still unjust. What do we need to know? And I thought, for me to know what we need to know, we need to first understand what the problem is. So this chart is my compilation of what I found it means to be black and educated in the current system. To be black and educated is to have identity crisis, where you are black on the outside, but inside you feel white. And you go through school being educated that you're English, and when you start to speak your good enough English, people still ask you, where are you from? So many students keep wondering, am I Canadian? Am I Nigerian? What exactly am I? Where do I fit in? To be black and educated is to be dehumanized. Many black students, again, will tell you about their countless encounters with racism in the classroom, with low expectations. In my own case, in the first year of my master's, the advisor that was assigned to me had incredibly low expectations of me. When I told him I wanted to move from a course-based master's to a thesis-based master's, he told me, Chizoba, you realize that it takes very good grades to make this happen. And I was like, oh, why am I getting these reminders? Did I get into U of T based on charity? Like, what is this? So at the end of my first year, I got 2 A+ and an A. And I thought, okay, of course, this should change the conversation I have with this advisor. It didn't. I asked him for a reference letter, and he wrote me back an email telling me that I did not qualify for the scholarship I wanted to apply for. And the reason was that I did not go to school in Canada. And I was like, oh, I did not go to school in Canada. How do you make such conclusions? Apart from the fact that you did not look at my file, and you only just made an assumption based on my skin color. A white South African that went to school in Cape Town, that assumption will never be made. To be black and educated is to be pushed out of school. This is especially the case for young black students in Toronto, in Canada, who go through school with a culturally irrelevant, disconnected curriculum. And so when they become restless, they're either called out as being badly behaved, suspension begins, and their relationship with the prison system is enabled. To be black and educated is to be an agent of your self-destruction and the extinction of your culture. So when you go through school with an absolute silence on everything that has to do with your heritage and your culture, and you're only learning that the beginning of your heritage is from Adam and Eve. Meanwhile, your ancestors predate Adam and Eve. So that silence, you embody an inferiority about your heritage. So you want it to go away anyways. To be black and educated is to be violated and constantly exposed to violence. Apart from the emotional violence, throughout the course of my doctoral research in Nigeria, I surveyed more than 1,000 students, and almost all of them told me that every time they spoke their indigenous language in school, they were punished. And punishment means you're detained, it means you're fined, it means you're flogged. To be black and educated is to be miseducated. You learning that everything about yourself is rubbish. Meanwhile, the society you live in, meanwhile, Canada is very rooted to Canadian philosophy, to European philosophy, to French philosophy. And you erasing yourself from yours only sustains this current system. To be black and educated is to be undereducated. Many of us have a very strong desire to change the situation within our communities. But we come to school, and school is underwhelming because we are not learning important things that we see every day. So in my case, I spent 2 years and I still didn't have anything to show to people in my village, for example. To be black and educated is to be a precarious worker in addition to being a student. You go through school, people are throwing racist postcards on you, metaphorically. And you always have to explain, be in the reactionary mode of explaining why this is racist, why this is inappropriate. In addition to you wanting to finish your degree on time. In addition to you wanting to do it excellently. And this happened to me 2 weeks ago where I was in the class. And the white professor addressed another person, another white male, as a barbarian. And I was like, what, barbarian? And so I disrupted the class. I was like, can you further explain what you mean by barbarian? He's like, oh yeah, you know, when white guys don't cut their hair, they call them barbarians. I quickly Googled, and nothing like that came up. All I saw was savage. I was like, oh my God, I was really restless in that class. And this was under an hour. He had said like 5 inappropriate things. And I'm like, okay, I'm supposed to be focusing. Why am I all of a sudden, like, I'm so agitated? So after the professor wrote to me asking me to explain my perspective, and I'm like, I ain't got time for this. Like, this is what I came here to do. Like, I'm not a consultant. Like, maybe if you want me to say all of this, go call the university president, go call the School of Graduate Studies, and I talk to people that can actually change things. But this isn't just only me. Like, this is what many of us go through university having to do, in addition to wanting to pass. The education system to the community, I think, has divided, is ruling us, and is trying to conquer us. And this happens where black students in the arts, in the commercial stream, in the vocational stream, in the science stream, aren't learning anything that has to do with history, culture, because they are told, well, physics is universal, biology is universal, business is universal. While the people in arts, some of us in the social sciences, learn about our history from a Eurocentric lens, while some of us learn from an African-centered lens. So these intellectual divisions that is occurring within the community divides us, and we spend time talking about rubbish as opposed to being united intellectually to understand how we should move forward. And also, we go through school learning about our differences. Like, you don't learn to understand how you're connected to people in the Caribbean. You don't learn to understand that you being here is because other people, other black people have fought for us. I think this needs to sink into our heads, and I want us to, I think all of us need to be all the more enraged because these issues, these attributes I speak of are not new. Since 1935, I'm sure people have written earlier, Carter Woodson wrote about the miseducation of the Negro. Chinua Achebe has written about it. Ngugu wa Thiong'o has written about it. Lots of articles about it. So the question then becomes, why isn't anything changing? Why isn't anything changing? So this takes us to the first point I'm trying to make in this lecture. Njoki Wayne, a professor here, I think has an answer for us about why things are not changing. She explains, it should be understood that colonization through education was part of a much bigger and lengthier process. All the learning was embedded in a social structure designed to erode traditional knowledge and values. Colonial education succeeded in planting seeds for expansion, growth, and sustainability of imperialism. So what this means is that to be educated is to drain yourself of any understanding, any connection to your history, to your immediate environment that is different from where you go to school. And that turns you into an object, a consuming object that is necessary to sustain imperialism. And imperialism is simply economic expansion. And the flip side of imperialism, if you look historically, is racism. And black people are at the bottom. So what you must take from this is that the system is not broken for black people. It was simply designed that way. And I think the Nigerian example further deepens my point on this. In 1969, Nigeria had its first indigenous education conference. And the purpose of this conference was to design a new education system for post-colonial Nigeria. Now, before independence, the language of instruction in Nigeria was English. What it meant to be successful was to pass math and English to get a school sat, to be able to get a job in colonial Nigeria. After the conference, what changed? Nothing. Language of instruction remains English, even though there are 250 ethnic groups in Nigeria and 400 plus languages. What it means to pass in Nigeria is to get a C at least in maths and English. It was at this conference that history was pulled out of the curriculum and replaced with social studies. Let that sink in. And so everybody should ask, why in so-called independent Nigeria, what it means to be educated is to know absolutely nothing about yourself, know everything about Europe. You get a degree, you get a job. But if the flip side is know everything about your culture, like know about your Igbo heritage, in my case, fail English, you're not going to pass. No job, no degree. And this conception of success that is alienated from our culture is what is required to come to Canada to go to school. The mannerisms that we pick up in pursuing the vision of success that is Eurocentric and disconnected from our cultural environment is what makes us fit in so perfectly here. Yet, we're still asked, how come you speak such good English? To be educated is to be intellectually colonized, is to have your brain, like not to be thinking, essentially. So Grossfugel, there's a scholar that speaks very eloquently that one of the most powerful myths of the 20th century was the notion that the elimination of colonial administration amounted to decolonization of the world. This led to the myth of a post-colonial world. In this picture, the first scenario is that there's a colonial administrator with a gun on your head. The second scenario would be where we think we are. There are no colonial administrators on the ground in Nigeria or here, although colonization continues to happen within communities. But now we are the ones holding the guns to our heads. So the question becomes, why? And how is this a thing? Maldonado Torres has an interesting explanation, and he essentially argues that the legacy of colonialism, called coloniality, must be understood and tackled further. And I'll just read what he says. Coloniality is different from colonialism. Colonialism denotes a political and economic relationship in which the sovereignty of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such a nation an empire. Coloniality, instead, refers to a long-standing pattern of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that defines culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administration. Thus, coloniality survives colonialism. It is maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of people, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. This brings me to my second point, that we've probably been chasing colonialism and thinking that colonialism is over because the administrators that were holding the gun are out of the building. But coloniality is there. And you see this in the fact, in the Nigerian example again, before independence, Nigeria was arranged around 3 major ethnic groups, even though there are 250 ethnic groups. So there was a hierarchy. And the major ethnic groups, members in there, had access to certain privileges that the so-called minorities didn't have. Post-colonial Nigeria, quote unquote, that hasn't changed. still the three major ethnic groups. Nobody's learning anything about themselves. So in there is coloniality. And until that is taken down, until you create a multicultural space where each of these cultures exists in a mutually inclusive way, or in an inclusive way, you've not tackled coloniality. Walter Mignolo extends this, and I think he has a perfect explanation that I found helpful in my own research and reflection. And Walter Mignolo argues that the current world that we live in, which we would refer to as multicultural, free, inclusive, isn't. And that all that we have today, in terms of the religion, the holidays we celebrate, the days of the week that we have, has come at the cost of ethnocides, linguicides, genocides. And he says that even though this world is presented as a neutral and universal world, you can in fact trace the cultural norms of today, the holidays we celebrate, the religion we subscribe to, the political system we subscribe to three major events in Europe. And these three major events are the Glorious Revolution of 1668 in England, the independence of the American colonialists from the British Empire in 1776, and the French Revolution in 1789. The tenets, the gains from these revolutions, which is the freedom to practice Christianity, the freedom to practice liberal democracy, the freedom to be a capitalist, became universalized through the Christian missionaries that showed up in different parts of the world. And so he argues that there are three macro narratives of the current Euro-modern world that we live in, and they're all driven by 6 imperial languages: English, German, Portuguese, Italian, and Spanish and French. And so indeed, he says that the world that we live in is a universal world informed by a uni-knowledge system, even though there are multiple cultures, multiple people around the world. And so he argues that we need to move from a universal world that is informed by just European knowledge, that is sustained by a forgetfulness of the genocides, the ethnocides that have led to the dominance of this European universal world that we live in, and that we need to move to a pluriversal world where all the diverse cultures, epistemologies of the world that were shut out as a result of colonialism, we need to bring them in and create a world where all the multiple knowledge systems, all the multiple philosophies start to inform the world. And so he explains, why do we need a pluriversal world? He says, because there are many beginnings beyond Adam and Eve and Greek civilization and many other foundational languages beyond Greek and Latin. With and in each language comes different concepts of economy that of course Adam Smith was unable to think, and other political theories beyond Machiavelli or Thomas Hobbes, and different conceptions of life, which leads to philosophical practices that cannot be dependent from Greek canonical dictums in matters of thought. So in my village, for example, our philosophy, we call it Omenala. And so in our Omenala, this is connected to the days of the week that we believe we have. We have 4 market days. And our 4 market days is connected to our economic system. In my village in Umunon, you only go to, we have Nkwo Market Day. And you can't have a funeral or anything on Nkwo Market Day. So in my village right now, we operate on 2 parallel systems, because the socio-political economy is connected to this Western system, what the government policy says, while the people do their culture behind the shadow. And so the education system is also connected to this Western vision of the world. Meanwhile, our Omenala, our philosophy, our market days, our heritage, students are not learning about it in school. So what does change look like? So obviously, we need a pluriversal world. But for us to even begin that shift to a pluriversal world, the first thing is justice. The people, the knowledges that have been excluded from the room need to be brought into the room. Every student, every person is a cultural being. And so someone going to school in my village has a right to be able to learn in a way that enables them see the treasure, enables them see how they've gotten to where they are, because that is really the only way they would be able to ensure the community continues to evolve. So we need justice first. So this means in the classroom, every student must be able to bring their cultural self to the classroom. They must be able to bring their different origin story apart from Adam and Eve into the classroom. This automatically means that the teacher can't be standing in front. The teacher must be by the side because the teacher doesn't know everything. And the teacher shouldn't know everything. But the teacher can facilitate how young people ground themselves within their heritage. So every young person must be able to ground themselves in their heritage and then learn about other people from their own starting point. What this also means that the school system must honor difference. Instead of young people learning to think that we're all the same, we all speak English, we're all Christian, no, we're different. And the school system must see that difference as a site of knowledge. And young people must learn to start to think, what are the things that bring us together? Where do we converge? Where do we diverge? Difference is political. And this also means that schooling, the purpose of schooling is about justice. It's about changing the world. It's about ensuring that the community and the society continuously evolves. To ensure that the schooling system is responsive to the needs of the people. And this also means that how you measure success in this education system is obviously not based on your knowledge of English. It's based on your ability to solve the problems around you. It's based on your ability to connect with your passion. It's based on your ability to realize that mission that only you can achieve on this earth. For Black students. So, I think for us to change what it means to be Black and educated, we need to redefine who we are. So Ngugu wa Thiong'o says that the education system is like a cultural bomb to Black people. And I think we need to read this before I expand on the implications for Black students. So Ngugu wa Thiong'o says the effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. It makes them see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement. It makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. It makes them want to identify with that which is furthest removed from themselves. For instance, with other people's language rather than their own. It makes them identify with that which is decadent and reactionary, all those forces which would stop their springs of life. It even plants serious doubts about the moral rightness of the struggle. Possibilities of triumph or victory are seen as remote, ridiculous dreams. The intended results are despair, despondency, and a collective death wish. So for Black people, we need to redefine who we are. Since our education system has put us through thinking that we're English, now we know you're not English. I'm Igbo. So who are you outside of what the colonial masters have told us we are? I think all Black people need to renegotiate their relationship with the education system, with Christianity, with capitalism. And people will tell you, oh, but your culture, in your culture, you people they kill twins, you people do all of these fetish things. But Western civilization is the engineer of racism. Western civilization is thriving on slavery. But we all haven't jumped out leaving Western civilization. In fact, that's what we're doing here, trying to drain Western civilization. So we must, and if we don't own our own culture, we can't make it better. So I resist every discussion about the inferiority of my culture, and you should too. The only way to make our culture better is to start from where we are. And you are different. Any claim to be, reduced, any attempt to, want to give your English name instead of your full, complicated, hard-to-pronounce name, resist it. You are different. Let it not be mistaken. And after you redefine yourself, speaking up. We are all children of the struggle. Everything we have today is because other people have made it happen. Speaking up means everywhere you go, you see a problem, you talk about it. You disrupt the class. Don't give up on the vision that the world ought to be pluriversal. To expect less from other people is to say they don't have the capacity to do better. And I believe everyone has the capacity to do better. So that's why we call them out. After you redefine yourself, you need to declare your politics. You can't be angry about racism and sit still in the face of hierarchies and oppression within our communities. So every form of hierarchy, be it gender, be it class, be it sexuality, whatever, you must speak up. And once you figure that out, please connect it to your studies. Please connect it to your extracurricular activities. What is your purpose? So you define your purpose from this understanding of who you ought to be. And this is an ongoing process, by the way. And then, excellence is non-negotiable. Being able to talk about these things and expect changes means that you need to be able to open whatever doors wherever they are. So, all the more reason why you must ensure that you're studying something you're passionate about and you feel strongly about. And then lastly, build alliances. Concluding thoughts, Frantz Fanon is the best. I think everyone should read Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon says, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it in its relative opacity. And I think that our generation, what needs to be done, what needs to be completed is a project of decolonization. Colonization was simply not about political control and economic control. It was first of all about intellectual control. It was first of all about eliminating other knowledge systems. So our generation, our job, our generation, I'm talking about all the young people I'm seeing in here, fighting for the emergence of this pluriversal world, this plurality everywhere we go to, is what our generation must face. For allies, I think you also have to define yourself. I think all of us, white students, have also gone through school, brown students have gone through school thinking black people are at the bottom of everything. So I think all of us, and we become entitled to not knowing anything and expecting black students to always be patient. We don't have time for patience. Educate yourself. Gather yourselves within your community to learn about colonialism and how that has produced the world that we live in. And through that, make space. When you enter spaces, no black people, no colored people, ask, where are they? Advocate. And I think for the university, there's nothing to say. I think the university probably knows its history better than any other person. The university was built anti-black. So the university needs to take a look at the mirror. And U of T proclaims itself as the best in the world, best public institution. You always see it in the newsletter that we get. So I think U of T needs to take a look at itself and ask itself, what should it mean for us to be the best in the world? How do we make the university truly reflective of all the diversity that this world can contain? I think this is a moral issue. It's an ethical issue. And the university needs to act. And a lot of people have already spoken about the recommendations from more black professors, more black departments. The university needs to do it. And then lastly, I remain very hopeful, even in the world of Trump. So Margaret Mead said it perfectly: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So I hope my lecture today has made you a bit more thoughtful about decolonization, about the state of the world, about the absence of certain histories. And I'm confident that 200 years from now, it would be a different conversation. Thank you all.
So how are you, Chizoba?
I'm relieved.
Good, good. It was excellent. So one of the things that I found really interesting was that picture and this talk about saving Africa. And I remember being at U of T, going to Sid Smith, and people having this group about saving Jamaica. And I kind of asked them, are there any Jamaicans involved in your organization? He said, no, but we went there and built a school. I said, right. Okay, sure. But I want to talk about North-South solidarity, because there are many people here I know who care about issues in the global South, in the African continent. But we know there's a pretty troubled history of people going to save Africa. But for people who want to be allies around development in the African continent, where do they start? What's the appropriate thing to do? How can they be part of this?
I think the first thing, so first of all, thank you, Kofi. I think you're pretty cool, and I remember when they first told me you'd be moderating this, I said I had to give you a jab about your Rhodes Scholarship, because we know who C.C. Rhodes is, but I think this is part of the contradictions we face as black people, having to, and I actually do think the right thing to do is to take Rhodes money, because it's our money, use it to go to school, and talk about decolonization. So...
And I'll tell you, when I was there and they said, a toast to the founder, that was when you kind of just put the cup down.
Exactly. And that happened at Massey with me too, where we have to make a toast to the Queen. And I'm like, nah, the Queen owes me money. No toast to the Queen. No toast to her, man. But to your question, I think the first thing Canadians must do must be to understand the complexity of the problem. And in talking about the Nigerian situation, I hope people are able to grapple with all the things that are wrong, starting from the beginning of the education system, in that the foundation of the system was not designed for the diversity of the country. The system was simply designed to maintain British control in the country. So I think there's that. But there's the other side of hypocrisy, and I think people have gotten used to looking at Africans as objects, because in Canada, nobody can just come from Nigeria and decide, I'm coming to build a school. In Canada, you just don't do that. So what gives people the confidence to think, you know, you have 4 weeks off, you're just going to travel to Africa to save Africa? Canada doesn't thrive on ad hoc schools that are built anywhere. Canada has a strong public education system, which we fight about every day. And we all are aware of the role of public education in making Canada what it is. Why do we think it will be different in Africa? It can't be. So I think people need to rid themselves of this anti-blackness. It must be, like you said, anti-blackness is now woven into our identity here. And I think that is part of the issue, this normalization of, this embodiment of it being normal to have double standards when it comes to Africa. So I think the first thing is that more people need to sit still in Canada. Go read up on history. Take the Canadian foreign policy as your case study. to understand how the Canadian foreign policy continues to enable colonization, begin the juggling and tackling from Canada. It requires research. It requires going to Ottawa. It requires writing to your MP to ask him, what are you doing about advocating for public education in Africa? But Canadian foreign policy is tailored towards more private investors, towards opening more private schools. And then secondly, there are lots of people that are tired and doing things on the ground on the continent. So for myself, I see that my next step after my degree is to begin a grassroots movement where I change the process through which education policy is made. Since the current education policy we have was made in an exclusive way, the alternative would be to create an education policy that is made in an inclusive way. Now, more people need to support grassroots movements. There are people on the ground that already have a vision of what the society needs to look like, and they also respect the fact that the beginning can't be politics. So many people tell me, oh, Chizoba, you should run for office, but that can't be my first step. In a country where we're still struggling with identity, the first step is redefining who we are. Canadians must understand that. Think about how Canada has come to be. Look for grassroots organizations that are starting from the ground, and you support them. Wherever they tell you is where you follow. But the first step, really, learn about the history of the world from an anti-colonial lens. Take Canadian foreign policy as your case study to understand the opportunities and problems. And then look for grassroots organizations in Africa that are trying to decolonize their societies and ask them what they need. I think that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because when I was in Zambia doing my master's field work and I was talking to activists there, they said something very similar in that they said, we don't need you here actually taking jobs that local people need. What we need you is fighting in the context that we can't fight, which is within your own country, exactly, with your own government. Exactly. And so that perfectly lands for me. Going deeper a little bit about kind of development in the African continent, I wanted to ask you about Nigeria, okay, which is clearly a place you're passionate about, have done much work in. Hopefully we will see you running for office there in the future. If not here, you'd be welcome to as well. But people speak a lot about Nigeria as kind of this, the term is used all the time, sleeping giant. It's a country with nearly 200 million people, rich cultural heritage, many resources, population that's been educated, certainly in the existing system, to a wide degree, but has never seemed to achieve the level of development or robust growth or influence that people have expected from it. Do you accept that narrative? And if you do, what are the pieces that are missing for there to be that real equitable, sustainable development taking place in Nigeria?
So the first thing I always tell people, and I always say this to Nigerians, is that Nigeria is a scam. Because the idea of Nigeria was nothing the people called Nigerians created. The name Nigeria was given to us by Lord Lugard's girlfriend. So the idea of Nigeria, I think, is something Nigerians that have inherited this scam haven't quite reconciled itself with. And I think the leadership we've had since independence hasn't enabled us to answer this question about on what terms must we remain together, given that our union was based on a colonial purpose of sending resources to the Queen. So now we say the Queen is out of the building. How do we restructure this nation? Do we need to be together? Or if we stay together, how do we ensure that the diverse ethnic groups with unique origin stories have equal space, equal say within the space called Nigeria? That has not happened. So until that happens, until we get leadership within the continent, and I think the Nigerian case is just one, but I think across the continent, it's first of all issue of definition, self-definition. So many people, when they talk about issues on the continent, they talk about corruption, the war. I think those are simply manifestations of a foundational problem. which is, who are we? Who do we need to be now the colonizers are out of the building? Until that happens, we will continue to have a class-based society. So in Nigeria, our elections now have become a choice between ex-dictators or ex-military rulers versus young people that are connected to the political class, but are largely disconnected from the grassroots, from the everyday people on the continent or in the country. So elections don't mean much. And so the people in power are the elites. And so you see that we so-called elites, and I guess I should accept my privilege, is that we go through private schools. Everybody is now channeled into private schools. And everybody's parents wants the best for them. If you can afford to leave the country, you know not to go to a public school, a public university. And so that's what my parents did for me, pushed me out of the country. But when you come here, the racist white man doesn't know the difference between me, that may have lived in a different part of Lagos, versus somebody that lives in the slum, right? So it's also in our self-interest. So the idea of us being able to tackle the class question, being able to tackle the self-definition question, all of that needs to be based on the premise of us centering our humanization, our dignity as human beings, then as Nigerians, if we stay together, to say that, no, we're going to build a society that is inclusive of all of us in spite of our differences, and we're also going to respond to the marginalization that has happened as a result of this current system that we have.
And just on that, because I see how that happens in the context of schooling, and this is with so many of our issues, because we can focus on young people. What about all of the folks who are outside of school, who are at different stages in their lives, who are going to be there? You know, it's kind of like the argument about racism in the United States. Oh, when that generation passes away, there will be no racism left. And it's realizing, well, those people are still going to be there for a while and voting. And so this issue, we've got to handle it now, not just wait for utopia. So how do you see bringing that dialogue or discussion about identity outside of the school system in Nigeria?
So I think, you know, when I first began my PhD, I was open to the possibility of working within the private sector. But now I can't, because I do realize that, you know, the people that are pushed out of school, Nigeria has the largest out-of-school population in the world, 10.5 million people. And so where are all of these people going to go to? Who do they become? And given that, even when we all leave, we still don't get respect, we will continue to be called shitholes until we are able to take care of our business at home. And private schools won't solve that. We need public institutions. So I'm interested now in being a platform for everyday Nigerian to be able to redefine who they are, find the terms on which they want to engage with Nigeria, and its implications for education. And that then could become what I have called the grassroots manifesto for education reform in the country. And then we connect that to a political cycle. So we're not just waiting for an election to come and wait for some miraculous politician to show up with a plan to save us. Before election comes, I think we need mobilization outside of the school system, within communities, led by these people that are pushed out of the school system, them reinventing the narrative of what it ought to mean to be educated. And then we hijack that and connect it to the political cycle. They begin by holding the politicians within their communities accountable, asking them, what are you going to do? What is your opinion on this manifesto we've created? So I think that more people, more of us so-called elites that have been privileged, you know, to go to school. My father's generation, they didn't have any of this kind of privilege. You know, they were trapped in the war. And so we that are beneficiaries of a lot of hard work and sweat, because even if we don't change these things, our parents will be humiliated. My father was profiled at the airport yesterday. ask several questions, wanting to verify you really have a daughter that has a PhD. You sure? So in my mind, like, no matter what, like, we need to fight for our dignity in spite of whether you're in school or you're not in school. And that is at least one thing I owe my parents, to ensure that, yes, you didn't have the opportunity to do all of these things I'm doing, and I'm doing it because you've sacrificed all of this. But at least let's be able to guarantee your dignity when you leave Nigeria. And I think that's the same thing for the out-of-school population. And the only way it must begin is by us being able to create a framework of inclusion, a framework of justice, a framework of decolonization, and use it to frame conversations and community reflections about what the education system must become. And I think that is the very first step to being able to engage the out-of-school population. And I don't think, and I'm open to us having a conversation about an alternative way of being educated. Maybe we all have to, we have to think of other ways to fuse the informal education system to the formal education system. But that conversation must be had, and I think until that is had in an inclusive, just, and respectful way, we wouldn't know what to do with the out-of-school population.
Thank you.